Hi everyone, welcome to today's video. In today's video, it should be a little different format today. We have a special guest with us, and he is...
Hi, I'm professionally known as James I Wong. I'm a professor of history and geography at Skyline College. My nickname is Jimmy, because that's the name I was born with, and that's on my social security card. And that's the name that most family members and non-Chinese classmates in elementary school have always known me as Jimmy.
And also, we are proud to say that he is our uncle. He is our uncle on our dad's side, the oldest brother of our dad. So in Toisan, we would call him, address him as Ibok. So throughout the video, we'll be calling him as Ibok. Part of what Josh and I try to do, right, as content creators is we try to document our experiences in our life and also areas of where we're interested, right? So there's food, there's culture, and our lifestyle. Especially since May, right, was AAPI month, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and also too with the increased attacks and racism towards the Asian population, which we know is definitely not a new thing. We want to talk more about our culture, right? As well as, it's like two things. One is in society culture, but also with our family history, our family background. And I think the Chinese proverb, when you drink water, think of its source. So it's remembering where you came from and acknowledging that too. And that kind of goes with what our goal is that we want to create our legacy, right? But again, both two things. One is where we honor the past generations and inspire the future generations. So with that, for today's video, we want to talk to our Ibok about, so now we do know, currently we are in the Bay, so San Francisco Bay Area in California, but we know our family originally came from China. So the question to Ibok is, how did our family come from China to US, specifically first Iowa? Ibok, take it away.
Well, you know, the history of the Chinese to California, to the United States, started even before the gold rush of 1849. Chinese had been in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba, Peru, Trinidad, before 1849, mostly as workers, contract workers. The news of gold and other opportunities, economic opportunities spread throughout the whole world, and the Chinese were among these people who came. After the gold rush petered out, there were opportunities for Chinese, for cheap workers, particularly like with Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, to build a transcontinental railroad that started in 1863 and finished in 1869. For the next number of years, job opportunities were available to the Chinese, but there was a lot of resentment to the Chinese. Because they were seen as so foreign, non-white, non-Christian. By 1882, Congress passed the first Chinese exclusion law. Now they call it the Chinese exclusion law, but it really was a restriction. It just slowed down the numbers. It did not exclude all Chinese. So some Chinese were still able to come. That was 1882. In 1888, they extended it. And then in 1892, the famous Geary Act was passed and trying to make it almost permanent. In other parts of the United States would also pass Chinese exclusion acts, such as in 1900, Hawaii, which became a territory of the United States, also slowed down the number of Chinese. So the Chinese who were able to come here did so with what we call a grandfathering. Certain Chinese were able to come, and they were able to allow, because of the laws, allow their children to come. And this all changed in 1906 with the San Francisco earthquake and fire. In April, the San Francisco earthquake and fire demolished hundreds of buildings, endangered thousands of lives. But in that process, what was going on, all Chinese had to have, for lack of a better word, similar to what we're going through now, sort of like a vaccine passport. All Chinese had to carry a passport, and that authorized them to be able to stay in the United States. A lot of records were destroyed, even government records. And so they had to reconstruct the government records of all these Chinese immigrants. And this is where we have the practice of the paper sons start. And so what many Chinese did was go in, recreate their records, indicating their name, their marital status, the name of their wife, if they were married, the name of their children, if they had children. Well, what happened was they started, by doing this, they told what we would call white lies. They fibbed, that's the expression. And they would say that they would have more children than they actually did, because in the hopes that family members, could be able to come over to the United States through them. That's what we call grandfathering. And this is the beginning of what we call chain migration. So we call these paper sons. And most of the time, they were men who came over. Women, stayed home, took care of the in-laws, took care of the grave sites, took care of relatives. So Chinese came over. So let's move to 1930s, okay? This is during the Great Depression, but there were still Chinese here going through paper sons. And one of them was a man whose last name is Fong, F-O-N-G. But he was originally from the Wong village. And he came, through somebody else's paper son. So he had to, quote, change his surname from Wong to Fong, okay, F-O-N-G. And he was able to do that. And by that, he was able to bring other people over from the Wong village. Again, this is what we call that chain migration, where family members come one at a time. To this day, if you go to certain parts of the United States before, you would have a lot of, as you indicated, Toisan. Toisan people came primarily to San Francisco, okay? Now, near Toisan is a place called Zhongshan in China. And Zhongshan, you would see a lot of the chain migration of people from Toisan to Hawaii. You had the same thing of people from Fujian province. You would see many of them go to the Philippines. And today, even many of the Fujian people go to New York City. So that's part of what we call chain migration. Well, anyway, we had people, Toisan people in Illinois. And so what happened was your great grandfather, my grandfather on our father's side ended up in Peoria or Quincy, Illinois. Okay. And he was there working, mostly in Chinese restaurants. My father came over through the Wong connection, okay, of a man whose last name was Fong, F-O-N-G. So my father, your grandfather on our father's side, on his paper, always used the last name Fong, F-O-N-G. And that's the, in case you didn't know, that's the name I and your father were born with. We were Fongs until about 1959, 1960, when our father went to, first of all, Omaha, and then went to San Francisco to correct the records. They had, the federal government knew about this eventually, and they offered an amnesty program from 1956 to 58, given that around that time, that if you just come in to these paper sons or paper daughters, if there were, but mostly paper sons, they'll come over, straighten out the records. It was sort of like what we call a amnesty, but then they had to, quote, confess that they entered the United States illegally. And if they had done so, but had paid their income tax, all their taxes, and not had a criminal record or such like that, it would be granted amnesty and they could remain in the United States. And that was, my father and your grandfather on your father's side. And so then I remember, I think I was in the 6th grade, and the teacher came, and I remember her name was Mrs. Morningside, and she said to the class, "Oh, we're losing a student today, but we're also gaining another student." Okay, And the new student is Jim Wong. And I go, Wong, Wong, that sounds Chinese. Hey, wait, that's part of my Chinese name. And then I realized, oh, that's my father, because then we change our records. But we're losing Jim Fong. Things got better for the Chinese in 1943 because we had the Chinese exclusion laws, but foreign-born Chinese could not become American citizens through the naturalization process. There were some Chinese who did. Those were the exceptions. Those were mistakes done by the government. But most Chinese could not become naturalized citizens if they were foreign-born. If they were American-born, like I was, like your father, like you, then you're American citizens at birth. Your grandfather, my father, ended up in Peoria, I believe. And ironically, he ended up with his father from the village. But our grandfather, my grandfather, your great-grandfather, I believe he came over with the name Wong. But our grandfather, my father, came with Fong. So that's why we had that. Now, somehow, my father had a great uncle, okay? Because of the chain migration, there were family members, but a lot of the family members didn't stay close together in the same town. If they could, if they could, they would. But many times, if they had Chinese restaurants, they would branch off, go to other towns nearby. Because if you had, remember, these are small Iowa towns, small towns in Illinois, small towns wherever. If they had 2 or 3 Chinese restaurants, it's too much competition. So you would go to, when somebody would branch off, go into another town and try to open up a Chinese restaurant because that would be the only Chinese restaurant in that town. So it makes sense, okay? But when they did that, and but it was hard to find other people to work if they were Chinese because there aren't that many Chinese in Illinois outside of Chicago or in Iowa. So it was common for other Chinese, if they were in the area or going to school or such like that, they would go to the Chinese restaurants and try to get a job there. Sort of a part-time job for meals or some extra money. And so, but again, somehow my father, your grandfather, ended up in Waterloo, Iowa, because he had a great uncle who lived in Waterloo, Cedar Rapids area. That's Tom Wong. Now he followed his brother, who had a Chinese restaurant in central Illinois, very small town. It just so happened, to make connection with my father. And so there was a Chinese restaurant in a town called Waterloo, Iowa. And so my father thought it was an opportunity to go there and he would be close to his great uncle. And so my father got a job there, washing dishes, doing kitchen work and stuff like that. Now, eventually, my father had saved up some money and through the help of Tom Wong and such like that, because they had an opportunity that some Chinese workers could actually buy into a business and become a partner by offering money. Then, of course, it's like what we call investment. However, that was in 1941, 42. And if you remember history, something happened on Sunday, December the 7th. And that was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, that sort of short change stopped the opportunity for my father to get into this Chinese restaurant. And so what ended up happening is he went into the military in 1942. Because after all, like many Chinese in the United States, their homeland, the original homeland, had been invaded by the Imperial Japanese. So they joined, they enlisted in the army at that time. And in the army, they were, because in that time in 1942, before 1948, the American military was segregated, meaning you did not have Chinese soldiers or black soldiers or Mexican American soldiers fighting side by side with white soldiers. My father was assigned to the group that became known as the Flying Tigers, and these were pilots who fought, who became part of later on the 14th Air Force. My father was not a pilot, but he provided, support. I think his job was a mechanic and also ordnance. Ordnance was loading up the airplanes and other machines with bullets and machine guns and such like that. And so he had served, did 2 tours. He did not re-enlist, but he was already in China. And so he was discharged in China, fortunately. And instead of coming back to the United States and being discharged, he was already in China. And then this was when the war ended in 1945 against the Japanese. And then, like many of the Chinese soldiers or Chinese American soldiers who had been fighting in China, particularly from those in the Guangdong or Canton or Toisan area, they went back to the area to find wives and to marry. And that's what my father did. He was there with other Chinese going back trying to find wives. Now, finding wives in China is different than finding wives over here in the United States, because most of the time it's all done through what we call arranged marriages. You have a professional marriage broker, a go-between, and then that's how he had the opportunity to meet and end up marrying my mother eventually. And then, but again, he was still part of the American Armed Forces, and he was able to bring my mother over in a couple of years in 1947, because he was an American soldier. And we had that, and that was through what we call the GI War Brides Act at that time. So anyway, after the war, my father went back to Waterloo, and he got somehow he had the money, and he was able to get into that restaurant. I believe it was called at that time, I just know it was called the Mandarin Cafe later on. And so he started working there in 1947, and that's when my mother came and ended up giving birth to me in Allen Memorial Hospital. And shortly thereafter, many more. As a side note, after 1945, that's part of what we call the baby boom generation. And I was probably one of the very first Chinese born in the state of Iowa, at least after World War II. And thereafter, there were a handful of other Chinese families too, but I may have been one of the first ones. So that's how we got to Waterloo. Just, working, my father working in a Chinese restaurant. And that's how many Chinese worked, that and laundry or other manual labor. And my father was fortunate because he had family. There were many Chinese men who did not have family with them. So anyway, that's how we got to 1947 and thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ebok, for sharing that. It's good because I think growing up, like Josh and I, we would hear stories from my dad, and sometimes our grandparents, they would kind of tell us stories a little bit here and there. But this is the first time I think we ever actually had a full-on discussion, full-on chronological order of things. So thank you for sharing that.
I think we're close to the end of our session. We'd like to thank Bok, our uncle, for this first episode in kind of our revisiting our history, visiting our family history, and then part of the kind of getting to know our culture and our heritage.
Thank you very much again, Ebok.
Okay, thank you very much for doing this, and thank you for having me.
To you all, thank you all for watching this. Leave us a comment below if any of this conversation makes you think about your personal history or your personal story, or any other questions that you all want to ask us, leave us a comment below. Like this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and we look forward to adding more videos as part of this series. Thank you all.